So the purpose of my project was to identify the conditions under which countries would adopt women-friendly legislation. So, for example, legislation guaranteeing women access to family planning, or laws guaranteeing girls equal access to education relative to boys. And the interesting thing about Muslim countries in Africa is that there's a lot of variation. So a number of policies have been passed to help out women, but then a number have been rejected, and it's not very clear why that is the case. So I went to Niger to study 5 laws, 3 that were passed and 2 that were made very controversial and that were rejected. And I wanted to find out what happened with those 2 policies.
So what have you found out?
Well, I found out that surprisingly enough, that politics has a lot to do with what kinds of policies are rejected. And I find that timing is of the essence, that everything is about timing in terms of why policies might get rejected. So for the 2 policies that I study, one was a law reforming marriage and divorce and inheritance, and the other was a treaty on women's rights. Both were rejected during times of great insecurity. So one was in the case of really high inflation, and the other was in a case of extreme uncertainty for the government. The government was put under a lot of pressure to resign and cede way to a new government. So it's only in times of national crisis that governments are less likely to think about women's rights.
So religion is entangled with politics.
Definitely.
Did you talk to any religious leaders in those countries? What do they say? What did they respond to the government action, government policy?
So I was able to speak with about 40 religious leaders, and first of all, the responses were very diverse because there are many different philosophies concerning Islam and the relationship between Islam and women's rights. So there's a more, what you could call liberal branch that supported all of the policies, that didn't oppose anything. Then you had a more conservative branch in Niger that did lead protests against these 2 policies. So I found that there was a lot of multiplicity in terms of what people were saying. So it wasn't like there was one thing that people kept telling me. I kept hearing many different and contradictory things, which I think is perfectly normal for a country of any size.
So how about women themselves? Did you talk to any Muslim women how they react to these kind of policies?
Again, it was extremely diverse. So I also I spoke with 40 women who were in favor of all of the women's rights policies, and they very much adopt a policy that the state should do everything to improve women's lives. Then I also spoke with a certain number of women who were opposed to the legislation. So there were 3 women who organized these mass protests against one of the women's rights pieces of legislation. I was able to speak with them as to what was motivating them and what they thought would be a better alternative.
So what's their reason for opposing? Is it because their belief in the religion, or like why they oppose?
So I'll give you an example. In one of the treaties, it says that a woman and man should have an equal say in where to live. And the women with whom I spoke said that they oppose this because under Islam, the man should provide shelter, clothing, food for the family. And that if you made a law that said that men and women have an equal say, that actually takes away the responsibility from men and puts more burdens on women. So they were opposed to removing a woman's right to being taken care of in terms of material goods by the husband. So that was one reason they opposed this law.
And then for women who support those policies, does those kind of rules in Islam bother them?
No, well, in fact, many of them were practicing Muslims, so it was just the interpretations varied across them. I did speak with some women who felt like Islamic law should have nothing to do with the state law. Others felt like there was room for pluralism in the laws, or at least some sort of negotiation.
Okay, so in that country, the laws, is there a clear separation between religion and the state, like the case here in the United States, or they are kind of the law also take Islamic rules into consideration?
Okay, that's a great question. The country is a secular state, so it's not an Islamic state. The laws were mostly inherited from the French, since it was a former French colony. Now, in terms of things such as marriage, divorce, and inheritance, many people do not go to the state to settle those matters. They'll go to a local chief or a religious leader, who they'll call a marabout. And a marabout will issue a decision that the state will then respect. So it's more like they're separate spheres. Although you see sometimes that the lines become blurry. Like, for instance, there's an association of Muslim leaders in the capital, and I visited there a couple of times, and people come when there's a dispute, about who's going to inherit what. It's a very complicated issue, I think, anywhere. And I remember being there, and I saw a family there, and they wanted the Muslim experts to help figure out who's going to inherit what. And later that day, I was at a state court, and I saw the same family. And I asked them, well, I just saw you at the Association of Muslim Leaders. What are you doing here? And they said, well, the Association of Muslim Leaders said that our matter was so complicated that it's better that we go to a state court. So there's a lot of interchange and whatnot, but the state is a secular one.